Hey, folks, good evening. Well, there's a good croaky way to start. Good evening. It is Wednesday evening, and I'm glad to have you here. I see some of you already lined up. James, good to see you, brother. And Susie Q, nice to see you here. Thank you for calling me captain. And Jason, nice to see you too, brother. And Michelle, good to see you. Thanks, everybody, for being here so far. And we're going to get rolling here in just a minute. I just sat down, so I'm just arranging things. Pardon me. It's not a set studio. It gets rearranged every time I have to shift things around, make sure my lights are on, and all of that. And my wife and my son are still here in the studio doing some other things over there. So they're trying to be quiet and whispery. So if you hear that, that's what's going on. It's not EVPs. And so I've got myself a cup of coffee and try to keep myself awake because right after this show at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 hours from now, midnight Eastern, Rocky Stucci and I are on the Situation Room. So join us live for that right after this broadcast. Well, there might be a gap in between, but you get it. 2 hours from now. Donna, good to see you. Klaatu, good to see you as well. And some of you, I don't know who you are beyond your monikers on there. If you want to tell me who you are, what your name is, if that's easier for you, that's fine. If you want to keep it the way it is, that's fine too. So we've been talking about David, and before we start, pardon me. I have to tell you, as we do sometimes in these shows, I say these studies are not about current politics. It's not about current events, although I tie some things in. Um, but there are sometimes current events I like to make comment on. And I was in a discussion thread about the new live action remake of The Little Mermaid they're going to be doing. And my daughters put up a post, and they're all elated that the character is now going to be played by a beautiful young actress, a black actress with a beautiful singing voice. I got no problem with that on its surface. But as everybody's talking and they're all making these points about diversity and all of this, I said, well, I hate diversity for the sake of diversity. That kind of bugs me. And I said, I've got a creative process problem with this. I said, I don't like the fact that the directors of this live action are now going to make the character change the character to a black character. And of course, the arguments came in, well, it's a mermaid. There is no ethnicity. What do you got against diversity? Blah, blah, blah. I'm getting attacked, mildly attacked, on an issue of creative process. And then I said, because I'm kind of a purist. I said, I kind of like what has now become a classic Disney animated film that we're now changing that. And then, of course, in the course of conversation with 10 other people wanting to take me to task, obviously I'm a racist. Obviously I'm all of this and that. That wasn't said quite directly, but it was implied. And I said, look, I'm not talking about race. I'm not really even talking about diversity. I was talking about being a purist. I said, it's like movies like The Wild Wild West. I grew up watching that show. It's a show from the 1960s, if you've never seen it. It's about a government agent during the time post-Abraham Lincoln, post-Civil War era. And it was played by white guy Robert Conrad. And so I grew up with the character. And then Will Smith was cast to play the same character in the remake in the movie. And I didn't have a big problem with it. I enjoyed the movie. It was fine. But my complaint was James West wasn't a black guy. He was a white guy. That's what I grew up with. Well, now I'm a racist and I'm suddenly not interested in diversity because I can't make that creative leap. Well, I can make the creative leap. But when asked about separating it out from issues, asked about the creative process, I would say, I probably would not have cast a black man in the role of James West. Are we so uncreative that we cannot create new vehicles to carry those actors? And so this whole argument became one of that, and it's still going on. I had to walk away from it, and I said, look, I got things to do. And I said, if you guys want to keep kicking the dead horse, I said, all I did was express an opinion an opinion about the creative process, not an opinion about diversity. But I said, but if you want to get into political correctness and diversity, I said, I think my daughters would have my head on a platter if I started a political discussion breaking down in analytical form a deeper analysis of political correctness run amok in our country. I said, but that's not what this is about. So blah, 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 blah. Art, it's fine. Diversity is fine. A black Ariel is fine. And I said, to make my point, I said, I don't care if they had made Ariel still a redheaded Caucasian actress, but then digitally added scales and gills. I said, I don't really. Ariel. What did I say? Ariel. Ariel. That's what Sebastian said. Ariel. He has an accent. There's my wife's 2 cents on that. And so, I look at that and I say, I don't care if they had put digital scales and digital gills for effect on this new remake, this new reimagining of The Little Mermaid. And I said, and still, if she was Caucasian, had red hair and scales and gills, I would have resisted that too, even though it'd be a creative, great point. So it's not about race, and everybody wants to make it about race. And, oh, you're just not diverse. That's like, why do I need to be diverse? I'm talking about creativity here, retelling a tale. If I want to make something new, I can be diverse. Hell, even reimagining a story, I can be diverse. But when it's being touted as, I'm so glad it's finally, before I said anything, somebody's like, finally, we're giving black actresses their due. And I'm like, they get their due. I have a problem when it's being done for that reason, as opposed to something that's creatively adding to the story. So there you go. Blah, blah, blah. Racists make it about race. Exactly. And then somebody came in and showed a picture of, it's my own son-in-law, came in and showed a picture of Grandpa Simpson from The Simpsons with his fist in the air. And the headline said, yelling at clouds. Old man yells at clouds. And I said, what's with the ageism? Huh? So anyway, there's that. That's what I just came from. And I got to mention it because that kind of stuff, it grates at me that you can no longer even express an opinion that's separate from the diversity question, just one that's about the issue itself, recreating something, without somebody bringing in the diversity issue and making it about that. And where I'm supposed to be the racist here, all of a sudden, the old man screaming at clouds, they're the only ones that brought up race and diversity, not me. I brought up the creative process. So there you go. So that's my rant for this evening on a pseudo semi faux ad hoc political issue, which has nothing to do with King David, but I thought I'd bring that up for you. And I'm sure more things will be said later. Anyway, so, and by the way, I will say for the record, I think it's probably going to be a wonderful movie. And I think, my daughter even said, if you don't take the kids to see this, I will. And I'm like, why would you even say that? What would make you think I wouldn't take my kids to see it? Am I somebody that comes across as somebody that is, well, there's a black person in it, so I'm not going to take my children to see it? I'm not that kind of person, and my daughter should know that about me. So it grated me a little bit the wrong way, maybe even a little personally. I'm not offended, though, because I will tell you that issue came up today, too. Offense is a choice. Being offended is a choice. If I'm offended by somebody or something that's said, it's because I choose to let that thing or that person offend me. Offense is a choice. You can't offend me because I choose not to be. That doesn't mean I won't get riled up and pontificate about something. So anyway, there you go. Yeah, I'd totally go see it, Audrey. Absolutely. And welcome, Audrey. Good to see you. And Melinda, I'm not sure if I said hi to you already. And Becky, good to see you as well. Donna, I think I saw you, but just in case. So everybody, welcome. Melinda Biddle, good to see you. And Sterling, good to see you as well. And I quoted you already. Racists make it about race. You're absolutely right. So Jason, James, Donna, Audrey, Susie, everybody that's here, thank you for being here. So let's get rolling here on this topic because, frankly, believe it or not, on this series on David, I'm probably going to clip some of it a little bit because I'm really only, when I looked at it, I'm only about halfway through my material. So we're about halfway through the life of David because what I want to do with this, as I said last night, if any of this historical data seems a little dry to you, I mean, if history is not your thing or archaeology or anthropology, the reason I'm bringing that up is to show how, sadly, the biblical tale has been fictionalized. It's been tampered with. And it's obvious because there are many things about history, about anthropology, that do not match up to the biblical tale. It's a story that's been fictionalized. And so I believe it was done around David's day, though, if not at David's own command to his own scribes to write this story to make him look better. Somebody probably very shortly thereafter changed it. I don't think it was scribal 1,000 years later. I think it was pretty close to the time of David that this was done, because there are things that are mentioned that people would know about that they made changes to. And some of the other books that list the story of David in the Bible don't mention some of these things. And so they're things that I think were done probably by royal decree in order to make David look better and than he was, or at least by the priestly caste or by somebody that wanted the story to be a story that upheld the bolstering of Israel, the establishment of their history, their religion. They wanted all these things upheld, and in David. Now, it could possibly be that, remember we mentioned way early on, the whole idea of the coming Messiah, the Christ in the Greek, as we know him, Jesus Christ, is the way they present him in the New Testament. But the whole coming of the unknown Messiah out there in the future, the kinsman redeemer, once David's kingdom had been established and Solomon was there and the monarchy was in place, it suddenly got changed to the Messiah must also be of the line of David, the King David. And so David had to be painted in the best light possible. Perhaps this was all written a few hundred years later, when we've talked about the 72 rabbis who went to the Library of Alexandria in the 400s, got permission from Ptolemy II, the Greek pharaoh of Egypt, to go to the Library of Alexandria and reconstruct the Hebrew scriptures because they had been lost or destroyed in the Babylonian captivity. So they go back to find these documents and they reconstruct the scriptures. And that's where we got the Septuagint, which is basically the Old Testament that you see today is the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And so it may have been written as late as that, because this is where they also put other things, added other things to make sure that the story was clean and clear and that it told the story of the Israelite people as well as bolstered the faithful of Israel. So there you go. So now let's kind of get back into this. This story, as I hope you are seeing, is one that is a beautiful tale told in the scriptures. Some of it is time honored enough that even when you do research and you find out that may not have happened that way in reality, my reaction is, oh, really? That kind of disappoints me because I was hoping that, I put a lot of hope in that story, or there's a lot to, it's like we talked about the whole David and Goliath story. Look at all that has come from the David and Goliath story. Still today, it's in the common vernacular. People might not even know about the biblical tale, but they know what David and Goliath means. It's the underdog against the giant. But when we study that, you find that most probably David didn't do that at all. It was one of his men of valor that did it. And that's all in one of the past episodes. I won't recap it tonight. But those are the kinds of things that you look at and you go, that's disappointing. But do we want to teach and adhere to belief systems, even stories like this, mythos like this, because it's the way we feel about them? Or do facts have to transcend the way we want to feel? This is one of the things that drove me out of the church 20 years ago, was I was so tired of hearing things that were just to bolster the faithful, and we believe this because this is what we believe, rather than really digging in and finding out what the answers are. And as I've said many times, my goal with all of this is I want to know things. I don't want to be told things or taught things beyond the obvious. You have to, like, if you're going to learn Greek, you got to have somebody who speaks Greek teach you Greek. But I want to know things, and that's why I believe the faith elements of the story. It's because I know what they mean. And that's kind of what's driven me away from a lot of the faith elements of the stories, is that they don't, that you can take them or leave them. But the history is what sets the facts in stone. All right, here you go. Susie wants her flag. Yeah, tell it to Colin Kaepernick. He doesn't want the flag of his own country. So that gripes the hell out of me, but I will not even allow myself to draw myself into that because I don't want to talk about that. All right, let's get over to my notes and let's take this on. We left off last night talking about David having brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And he did that for a reason, because the Ark had been housed for almost 450 years in a small town that became a sacred site because of the Ark. There was something to the sacred land. And now David, in bringing the Ark to his newly conquered capital, Jerusalem, where there was no temple yet, there was just the mound, the mountain there, up above the existing city of David. That's where the temple was built. That's where now the Dome of the Rock stands in Jerusalem. But David's city, the small little half a mile by about a quarter of a mile wide slice on this hillside, packed in with thousands of people living in homes there. And the palace of David was built there. The citadel was built there. But up above that now would have been a blank hilltop where there was a wine, was it a wine press, or there was some kind of a, not distillery, the word's escaping me right now, that was owned by somebody else. David got the land. He acquired the land. We're going to get into that as well, how he acquired that land. And that's where eventually his son Solomon builds the temple. But David has erected the tent. Do you remember during the Exodus when they built the Ark of the Covenant, Moses and Aaron, and they built a tabernacle? It was called the Tabernacle of the Congregation. It was a tent. It was basically the temple in Jerusalem, kind of pared down to a tent. Big poles with a tent wall all around it. The tent inner holy place and the inner holy of holies, separated by this thick veil that the priest could only enter once per year. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And God was supposed to have dwelt on the mercy seat of the Ark. So they erected this tabernacle up on the top of the hill. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant was eventually placed. And so this is what David's done. Now, he's done this for a reason, not just religion, but what David was doing was shifting the cult of Yahweh or Jehovah worship from where it had been at Bethel up to the top of the mountain, Mount Moriah, up above Jerusalem, his new capital city. And this is where they now play. And so the people are like, why are you taking the ark there? That's not been one of our cities. It's not a holy place to us. Well, David decrees it to be holy. And David brings the ark there to establish that now the royalty, the monarchy, has power over the religion. And this is what David did. So it's not this beautiful story of, it's a story of control and power again. And David, the master strategist, what's the word I'm looking for? He not conniving, not crude or rude, or there's a word I'm looking for. He was ruthless in what he did and how he won the kingship, and now how he's establishing the state, how he's establishing the religion. This is all who the guy was. And so upon the ark's arrival in the city, David, further sacrifices were offered. We talked about every 6 steps he offered an ox and offered a bull, and they didn't burn them, which was the sacrificial mandate. They didn't burn them; they just sacrificed them. So I'm assuming the meat was consumed by people. But David did this out of his own livestock, his own riches. He funded this, and so David blessed the people in the name of Yahweh of hosts in 2 Samuel 6. And this again reinforced David's position as the head of the Yahweh cult in Jerusalem, in Israel. And aside from the regular blessings of sons by fathers, blessing is an act that's generally reserved for the deity to give and his appointed human messengers. The priestly caste could give blessings like this, other than the blessings of inheritance from a father to a son. And David claimed possession of the cultic symbol of the ark, and now he firmly claims the religious role appropriate to that possession. So this is what he's doing. He's setting up a firm kingdom. And the final ceremonial act of the ark's possession into the city of David was a purely secular one, non-religious altogether. David distributed to all the people present, according to the Bible, unrealistically, the entire multitude of Israel, man and woman alike. That's unlikely. I don't think all of Israel gathered from the far north and the far south and all came to Jerusalem. It's probably the inhabitants of Jerusalem and a bunch of the little towns that he'd gathered together for this. David had already established his unique wealth with all his sacrifices. Now he did so again with offerings not to God, but to the people. David had this long-known power of this well-timed gift. Like I said, he was a brilliant strategist. He showed with his redistribution of spoils to Judah. At that time, he was illustrating. Remember when he did that? He took all the spoils he had won in Judah and he redistributed them to Judah. But that's where he stole them from in the first place. But he redistributed them. It was the timing. It was buying off those towns. The benevolence of David, who is now your king. And at that time, he was illustrating the benefits of the military and the administrative subservience. Now, when he's bringing the ark in and the religion, the cult of Yahweh to Jerusalem, his new capital, he's demonstrating the benefits of religious adherence to the newly established royal cult. And you don't want to say it's his base is buying off the people, but he's being benevolent by giving the people. And so from start to finish, the procession of the ark into Jerusalem was constructed so as to elevate David to these new heights in the eyes of the people. This, make no mistake, is what David is doing. He endowed his new capital with religious significance by laying claim to the most prominent symbol of God's presence in all of Israel. He made himself out to be I lost my place because a message popped up right in front of my notes. He made himself to be, and by the way, I got to turn off my dinging bell so that doesn't interrupt this again. It distracts me. He made himself out to be the central officiant of this new Jerusalem cult. And he both displayed his personal wealth, and he made clear that the rewards that were available to those who accepted the new religious reality at the heart of the new Davidic kingdom. This is who they were for. And the bringing of the ark to Jerusalem is often viewed as a sign of David's great piety. He's got this fantastic new kingdom and religion that he's started. And he's a pious man. But it was, in fact, nothing more than a really shrewd political move on David's part. And he had claimed the political leadership of Israel by force. And now he's doing the same thing with Israel's religion. So, like many people you see in government today that claim they believe God or they believe in this or that or the other thing, is that really in David's heart? Was he really a man after God, pursuing after God's heart? Or was God for him, again, religion, another means of, as we've seen all through history, of controlling the populace? So in our modern age, with its common notion of a transcendent God who's accessible from anywhere throughout the intangibles of prayer and faith, the material realities of ancient religion are really easy to overlook. In early Israel, God wasn't transcendent. He wasn't available everywhere for people to talk to through prayer, according to the theology. But he was very much physically present, even if invisibly so. God had said to Moses, I will come to you and bless you. That's in Exodus 20. And at every sanctuary, for there I will meet with you, and there I will speak with you, and there I will meet with the Israelites. I will dwell among the Israelites. Exodus 29. Now, sanctuaries are these divine places where the deity was, don't think sanctuary city, but the concept is in there. It's where the deity literally dwelled personally and present. And through prayer, though prayer was this means of communicating with God, it was not generally sufficient by itself. You couldn't just go to God and pray. This was what was supposed to be unique about the Messiah coming, the Christ, about Christianity. It was supposed to be a show that you no longer need the go-between. This is why in the story of Jesus, remember when it says he dies on the cross, and it says, and when he said it's finished, bowed his head and died, and that the veil in the temple rent from top to bottom without hands touching it. This veil, this thick veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to dwell when they had it. That the veil ripped in two from top to bottom, no human hands. It was supposed to be a supernatural act that was showing that the Christ paid the debt of sin for man. He was the final sacrifice, the Lamb of God, the shedding of blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins, according to the Bible. So Christ had done that, and he had done away with the old temple worship. So this is what you get now. He's dwelling among us, but now you don't need that going through the priest anymore, because Christ was supposed to have been the sufficiency. And he opened up that transcendence to God. And prayer was this way of communicating with God, but it was not sufficient by itself. You needed sacrifice, the burning of a slaughtered animal on the altar, the bringing of raw or cooked grains, the pouring of wine libations. This is all Levitical law in the Mosaic law. This was the primary mode of appeal to the divine. This is why there was Passover. Each person had to come every year to the temple in Jerusalem and bring a spotless lamb that was to be slain and sacrificed, the blood shed as the offering for their sins. So they were covered for another year. This was the system of temple sacrifice. And when we put these two elements together, it becomes clear that the cult was not only a spiritual enterprise, but also an economic one. The ritual laws written by the priestly class of Israel, those found in the book of Leviticus, the books of Moses, not only invent new types of sacrifices previously unknown in Israel, the guilt offering, the purification or sin offering, but also institute rules about purity that require abundant sacrifices when none was needed in the culture or its religion prior to that. Almost every sacrifice, with the exception of the burnt offering, required that the offerer give some portion of the animal to the priests. And often the sanctuaries kept their own herds and flocks, so that offerers, rather than bringing their own animals, could simply come and buy one from the sanctuary and offer that one instead. If they're putting out their money, that's as good as raising one yourself. And tithing, if you've ever heard that term, tithing, even in the church, tithe, you bring 10% of your income to the church. Tithing and offering, they were the first fruits of the harvest of the first, or the firstborn of the herd. And the flock were ways to ensure the continuity of God's favor on the part of the offerer. And these were the ways for the priest to ensure the continual growth of the sanctuary's finances. The priesthood was a lucrative job. If you were a Levite, it was lucrative. And the sanctuaries were the most well established economic cornerstones of Israelite society. And can I take a little, just a little side venture here? Remember, what did in Jesus' day and in the story, when Judas goes to the Sanhedrin, the ruling religious body of Jews in first century Judea, in Jerusalem, what did he do? He went to the temple and he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. That was his price for betraying him. And the interesting thing was that week prior to that, like just a couple of days before the crucifixion, in the story is Jesus clearing the money changers out of the temple. This is exactly what we're seeing is establishing at the temple site, the tabernacle right now, the cult of Yahweh that David put together, that established. This is how the priestly caste lived. They charged money for the offerings, which makes sense. If you got to offer something and you don't own a sheep, what if you're a fisherman and you don't raise sheep? You got to get a sheep somewhere. And the priestly caste had their own flocks that you could pay for. This is how they made their money. So, what you've got established by the time of Jesus is this very well-oiled system. And you know why the Sanhedrin wanted him out of the way. It wasn't because of what he was teaching. Oh, this man's blasphemous. He's saying he's equal to God. They couldn't have given a rat's ass what he was teaching. What he was doing was swaying the people, especially after he cleared the temple. What's it recorded that he says in the story? It says that he fashions a whip out of leather straps, and he whips at the money changers in the temple that are selling the sacrificial animals. And when he does that, what's he doing? He's upsetting the inflow of revenue into the temple. So, sorry, this was a little out of position. I just noticed. So what's he doing? He's telling the people, he announces, he said, how dare you make my father's house, the temple, a den of thieves? He says, this is a house of prayer. And that was supposed to be the reason the Sanhedrin wanted him out of the way. The blasphemy stuff, that was all a sideliner. They wanted him out of the way because he was upsetting the flow of money into the temple. And this is where that sounds. So, thanks, Jeannie. I wasn't so worried about my sound as it was tipping into where I'm sitting. You can't really see the direction quite as well. It's tipping into my face. So this is what you see established with David. And so it's interesting now that 3 times a year on the major agricultural festivals held in Israel, it was common practice for Israelites to make a pilgrimage to a sanctuary, one of those little sanctuary towns we talked about. And as the great pilgrimage sites from medieval Europe demonstrate, significant ancillary economic advantage could be gained from these visits. These were big cash cow moments for Israel, for the religion in Israel, for the priestly caste. These pilgrims needed shelter. They needed food. They needed other supplies. And the local economy booms as a result. As a matter of fact, again, to the Jesus story, remember it says that Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem because Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, had imposed a census and they needed to all return to their hometowns. There still isn't any archaeological evidence for that ever having happened. But it was also happening at Passover time. It was the spring. And one of the ways you could tell was that the whole angelic announcement to the shepherds who were, and lo, behold, the shepherds were tending their flocks in the fields by night, and the angel of the Lord appeared to them. I'm thinking of Linus from the Peanuts special from way back in the 60s, if you remember that. And so for the shepherds to have been that close in to Bethlehem, just in the hills surrounding Bethlehem, that they could visit the manger scene that night beneath the star, according to the story, they would had to have been away from their distant, like wintertime and summertime distant fields. They brought the flocks close in to the cities. And why did they do this? Bethlehem was only 6 miles from Jerusalem. Why were the flocks in Bethlehem? Because they were bringing them in for the Passover. And these were the flocks that were probably tending the flocks of the priestly caste. So there would be temple livestock, and they're that close in. So that's another interesting little factoid when you start looking at the story. So anyway, so 3 times a year, these pilgrims, they needed shelter. Joseph and Mary, what happened? They got to Bethlehem and there was no place to stay. Why do you think that was? All these pilgrims coming to Jerusalem for Passover. There was no place left to stay. And it wasn't like you could get on kayak back then and make your reservations ahead of time. You just wandered into town and you looked for a place to stay for the night. And so that's why I believe there was overcrowding the night that they got to Bethlehem. And it wasn't because, by the way, I just have to make a point here, political point. I've heard more people. The first person I ever heard say this was the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Remember him in politics? Haven't seen much of him lately. He had said that he believed that Joseph and Mary were impoverished because they couldn't find a place to stay. I can tell you something. I don't think they were impoverished. I think Joseph was a skilled laborer, and he probably made very good money. And when they got to Bethlehem, they couldn't find a place, not because he didn't have money to buy a place to stay for the night, but because it was overcrowded. So there's a lot of misnomers about that story, no matter what you believe about this story. So in practical terms, in David's time, this meant that there was some competition for the faithful. All these little sanctuary towns wanting to draw people there for the festivals. And at least among the largest and most important sanctuary sites. And an entire community could be sustained for the year based on the strength of the local sanctuary. You had to have your sanctuary just doctored up. So remember when David came and got the Ark of the Covenant? He left Bethel bereft. One day they had this revenue producing thing. Now nothing. So this is an ambitious sanctuary, needed a draw, something to make its altar more attractive than the one a few towns over. And the same combination of cult and economy carried forward into Christianity, for which the cult of the saints, centered on the possession of relics, served as a major source of income for shrines throughout the Christian world from the 4th and 5th centuries to this present day. That practice hasn't changed much. It just looks different now. So in ancient Israel, physical objects such as the Ark of the Covenant could also do the trick. This sort of competition is behind the story in 1 Kings 12 of Jeroboam, a descendant of David's, Jeroboam's golden calves. Having split Israel off from Solomon's united kingdom, Jeroboam needed to draw the religious economy back away from Jerusalem, where it had been established since David brought the ark there and since Solomon built the temple there. So he made 2 golden calves, symbols of Yahweh. He put one in Bethel, a town near the southern border of Israel, and one in Dan to the north, saying, "You've been going to Jerusalem long enough," he says in the passage. And all of this is to say that in bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David was after more than the Israelites focusing their faith on a center of worship. He was after their wallets. And to make Jerusalem a viable center for sacrifice, one key element was required: a public altar on which to offer the sacrifices. And the biblical story about David came to build this altar in 2 Samuel 24 is really, it's a very complex story, and it's decidedly overtly theological. God rather bizarrely incited David to take a census and punished him for it by bringing a plague on Israel. So when the plague reached Jerusalem, God stopped it just as his messenger of destruction was at the threshing floor of Arona, the Jebusite. And the threshing floor stood on what is now the site of the Dome of the Rock up on Mount Moriah. And in thanks, David chose this spot as the place where he would build an altar and brought the property from Arana. I still don't pronounce that right. It's hard for me to, for some reason, I have trouble pronouncing the name. Araunah. Araunah. Or maybe quickly you can say Arona, something like that. But there is undoubtedly this kernel of historical truth in the notion that David took a census. The census in Israel existed solely for the purposes of identifying men of fighting age. It was for the military. It was the first step in military conscription to David's army in Israel in general. And for this reason, the census was generally viewed very negatively by the majority of the Israelite population. It's like when, if you're guys my age, remember when you had to go register for the draft? And that's still, I believe, in existence today. And to register for the draft. Nobody wanted to do that. I don't want to get drafted. Well, that's what this census was supposed to be for. And so the majority of Israelites hated it, including the biblical authors who describe it as instigated by God for the purpose of punishment, they said, is why God asked David to do this census. Conscription was just another means by which the monarchy, an untrustworthy institution to begin with, could impose itself on the freedoms of the people. Basically, Israelites were libertarians. Keep your hands off my wallet, keep your hands off my household. Don't tell me what I can and can't do in my bedroom. Don't tell me when I have to go fight. That's what this was all about. And so even the biblical authors wrote against it. Given the military function of the census and David's understandable need to know what sort of fighting force he could muster for his new kingdom, it's reasonable to assume that he did indeed take a census. This sounds like something David would have done. I think it's got a nugget of truth at the center. And probably relatively early in his kingship, he wanted to know who was who and what was available to him. And the story of the plague, however, appears to be no more than an etiology for why the altar was built where it was built. Yet no such narrative is really required. David's motivations for building the altar and his choice of the threshing floor of Arona are logical in and of themselves. Now, we've already seen in past stuff that we've covered that in the story of Keilah, remember the town of Keilah, the threshing floor was among the most prominent public spaces in every community. It needed to be large enough to accommodate a great number of people, for everyone would have been harvesting and threshing at the same time each year. And so it also needed to be in this big open space, which was not usually inside the walls of the city. It's where the wind could blow away the chaff as they were separating the wheat from the chaff. And as noted earlier, for walled cities like Jerusalem, which had been fortified since the Jebusite era, this meant that the threshing floor would be outside the city walls. It's just an important little tiny detail, this stuff, to look and see why things were done the way they were done in this story. So as Jerusalem was built on a hillside, the natural location for the threshing floor would have been the flat area to the north, up the hill. You don't want to go in the valley to catch the wind to have a big threshing floor. You out in the open. And so what's now known as the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock stands presently today. Now, there hardly could have been a better location for David's new altar. It would have to be prominent above the city, as close to the heavens as the landscape could allow. And the transformation of an agricultural area into a cultic one would signal that Jerusalem was distinctively religious center. And it had enough open space to serve the needs of the pilgrims who would come to sacrifice before the ark. By taking over and repurposing the threshing floor, David made certain that his capital would no longer be an agricultural community. It's now become an official urban community, dependent on royal income, both political and sacrificial, rather than on the land and the agriculture. So, who was Araunah, the Jebusite, the man from whom David purchased this property? Most likely, he was actually no one at all. Though Araunah is commonly understood, even by the biblical authors, as a personal name, it's also certainly a Hittite title, the same word, Urim, meaning Lord. That is, this threshing floor originally belonged to the previous Jebusite ruler of Jerusalem and was a sort of state-owned property. If this is the case, then we can also dismiss the notion that David bought the land from Araunah. And although the Jebusite community may not have been completely eradicated from this place when David conquered the city, it's certain that the Jebusite ruler would have been subject to David's overly hungry, blooded sword, as we saw many times over. And when David began his reign as the king in Jerusalem, this royal property would have devolved directly to him. And he would have had no need to purchase it. It was already his. And from the perspective of the biblical authors, it was important that David purchase the land. Indeed, they depict Araunah as trying to give it to David as a gift. Here, I'll give you my property. You take it. And David, refusing. Oh, no. I can't take that from you. And the depth of Israel's connection to the site of its temple was such that no possibility could be allowed for anyone else to make a rightful claim on the property sometime down the line. So this same impulse is at the root of the story of Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah during the life of Abraham in Genesis 23, where just as in this passage, the property is first offered as a gift and refused as a gift. And the land is fully Israelite, only if the claim to it is undeniable by both its previous and current owners. And so there it was thus very important for the biblical authors to make certain that everyone knows that this site where David built the altar and the temple would eventually be built, the site of the altar in Jerusalem, was authentically and incontestably Israelite. David, however, would have not have had such qualms. Taking the property of others was never a difficulty for David. But they needed to make sure that the people down through the ages would understand that this is God's property. And so the threshing floor of the Jebusite city thus became the cultic center of David's new capital. And it's to this very spot that he moved the Ark of the Covenant, protected by its traditional tent, the tabernacle of the congregation. And just as the threshing floor was the economic center of most Israelite communities, so now the ark and its new altar built by David would become the economic centers of David's Jerusalem, David's new capital city of Israel. And it's a communal space, not only for the surrounding area, but in theory, for the whole nation of Israel. And the establishment of Jerusalem as a religious center may have been probably one of the most shrewd economic decisions and moves made by David. But it also served this greater symbolic purpose. Throughout the entire ancient Near East, the king and the deity were always closely intertwined. I'm talking outside of Judaism. In Mesopotamia, kings were understood to have been these divinely appointed men to rule. They engaged in divine rituals such as sacred marriages, the sacred marriage to the gods, in which they symbolically slept with a goddess. They're depicted in art as taking the form of a deity. Among the Hittites, the king was also known as the chief priest of the land. One shrine shows the king being embraced by a god, and upon his death, the king was said to become a god. In Egypt, the obvious one, Egypt, the equation was simple. The pharaoh himself was a living god. And by the way, this is what with Moses. If you missed the whole thing on Moses, the book Exodus Reality, Moses, I believe, being raised in that his entire life until he's 40 years old, I believe he took that belief system with him. He saw himself as greater than the common man. He was one with God. And so David wanted to demonstrate this. This is explicit deification, and it was an impossibility in Israelite religion. But it would have been natural for David to want to demonstrate God's approval of his reign. And so the presence of the ark in his new capital accomplished this end for him. So in Jewish worship, the man, the king, was not a god, nor could he be linked with God. He could only serve God. And so what we have in David's bringing of the ark to Jerusalem then is this beginning of Israelite royal theology. The notion that Israel's king was akin to God's steward on earth. Saul, David's sole predecessor on the throne of Israel, he ruled by consent of the people. His reign legitimized by his ability to protect Israel from all its enemies, to gather the armies and fight for Israel. David, in contrast, positioned himself as divinely legitimized, a position he was more in need of than Saul, because he didn't rule by popular consent, but because he had the will of force that put him on the throne. And this claim of divine approval and even selection was a really common technique for establishing power. When Babylon was briefly captured by the invading Chaldean people in the late 8th century BCE, the conquering king claimed that Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, had personally selected him to rule. God has selected me. God has chosen me. Where have we heard that message before? Everywhere. Even today, you hear that. Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, when he conquered Babylon, he made the same claim. This is royal propaganda, folks, and that's all it is at its best. It's an attempt to persuade a defeated enemy that their new overlord came to power by choice of their own deity. Your God put me on place on the throne, in place on the throne. And though there's no reason to really doubt that David authentically worshiped the Israelite deity, Yahweh, I think he did, his possession of the ark in Jerusalem sent pretty much the same message that you saw throughout the ancient world. God has approved of me. I'm not an Israelite anymore, but God has put me on the throne. It is God's hand. Remember all the times that David said, I will not take the life of Saul, for he is God's anointed. And then all the people he killed for probably carrying out the murders he wanted committed, killing Ishbal, killing Abner, all these things. He put people to death for doing that. The guy who actually killed Saul took him out of his misery on the battlefield. And David had all these people killed because you laid your hand against the Lord's anointed. Well, he was establishing for himself that he would be the Lord's anointed. So it's at this time that royal theology would come to encompass not only David's reign, but that of his entire dynasty. It's therefore understandable that in the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, that a biblical author would explicitly link the arrival of the ark in Jerusalem to God's promise of an uninterrupted Davidic lineage on the throne. This is the famous passage in 2 Samuel 7, following directly on the ark's entrance into the city, in which God promises David through the prophet Nathan that God will, quote, establish a house that is a dynasty for you. When your days are done and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own issue, and I will establish his kingship. Your house and your kingdom shall ever be secure before me. Your throne shall be established forever. That's what the passage says. This is what God told David through the prophet. And this is the fundamental statement of the royal Davidic ideology. It projected back onto the beginning of the dynasty by authors who had known uninterrupted Davidic kingship for the previous 300 years when they penned some of this stuff. The text is pure theological invention, but its roots are in the reality of David's establishment of Jerusalem as a royal cultic site. The royal site of cultic worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem, in Israel. Now, that same chapter in 2 Samuel doesn't seek only to justify David's dynasty as divinely ordained, but also to address the well-known fact that must have pressed heavily on the minds of the later pro-Davidic authors. David, the great king, did not build the temple in Jerusalem. According to 2 Samuel 7, David is promised his dynasty because he wanted to build the temple. But he was dissuaded by God himself. The only way David didn't get that temple built was because God told him not to do it. The quote in 7:6 of 1 Samuel says, I have 2 Samuel, I'm sorry. I have not dwelt in a house from the day that I brought the people of Israel out of Egypt to this very day, but have moved out in tent and tabernacle. This is what God says to David. This text explains then why David didn't build the temple, but it fails to explain why, if God was uninterested in such a dwelling, David's son Solomon would be allowed to construct one, and a magnificent one at that. In the 4th century BCE books of Chronicles, this logical inconsistency is recognized. And it's explained that David didn't want to build the temple because he was a man of war, whereas Solomon was a man of peace. So it wasn't just God's mandate. It was, I'm a man of war. I shouldn't build the temple. I'll leave that to my son, whose kingdom I am establishing, so it will be a peaceful one. And both the explanations are, folks, the subject of this entire series I'm doing. They are both an apologetic. They're not real. They were added to glorify the story. And so what's commonly agreed is that David didn't build the temple. The question that the biblical authors seek to answer is, why not? Why didn't David do it? Is it for these reasons we stated? In truth, this question is relevant only from a later perspective, when the temple was the center of Israel's religious existence, and David was recognized as the greatest king in Israel's history. Modern scholars today, they've fallen sway to the same forces. They often go to lengths similar to those of the biblical authors to explain why David didn't build the temple. From the historian's perspective, the question might be relatively simple, answered in a very simplistic way. David didn't build the temple, or better, a temple, because he had no need to do so. He had the ark, he had the altar, and thus both the incitement for pilgrimages and the means by which they could offer their sacrifices. A physical temple was unnecessary. And what's more, David may have seen a temple as potentially drawing the revenues from the cult away from the royal court. Without a physical temple, the priesthood in Jerusalem was under David's thumb. He controlled what they did, appointed by him, maintained by him. And at least according to some to one passage in the Bible, David's own sons served as priests. Now, the priestly tribe was supposed to be Levi. David was a Benjaminite. So David's own sons served as priests. And a common reality in the ancient world, but an embarrassment later in biblical texts such as Chronicles, for the idea of anyone from a non-priestly lineage serving in the cult was absolutely unthinkable in the theology of the theocracy of Israel. The Jerusalem cult was a family business. And David had no reason to create any structures that might take on a life of their own. He needed to be in control of that. And the real question should not be, why didn't David build the temple, but rather, why would David build a temple? If David didn't build the temple, it's because he had no desire to. You've seen over and over again now in David that we're presenting, if he wanted to do something, he damn well did it. So, what we're being told in the story of David is that he was such a pure man at heart that he listened to what the prophet said God was telling him. Don't build a temple. And so by inaugurating the Israelite cult in Jerusalem, David accomplished something of lasting value for his nation. An achievement that still resonates today, like the unification of northern and southern tribes, the establishment of Jerusalem as the religious center of Israel, changed the course of history. And all of the emotions tied up in the city, from the exilic cry in Psalm 137, if I forgive thee, O Zion, forget thee, O Zion, to the medieval zealotry of the Crusades, all the way to the present conflicts over the status of Jerusalem as a joint Israeli and Palestinian capital, are grounded in David's vision for his capital. It's tempting to want to apply our own feelings to this about Jerusalem back into David's time, to ascribe to him the passion and the piety that the city inspires in followers, Jewish followers or Christian followers. The biblical authors themselves succumbed to this temptation. But David acted for far more mundane and self-serving reasons. The choice of Jerusalem as his capital and the decision to make it a religious center for Israel were primarily political and economic choices. They were grounded in the realities of David's seizure of the throne and his need to establish himself and his government in the eyes of a conquered and resentful populace. And the results, centuries on, may have benefited the entire nation, but the motivations at the time they happened were self-serving. And anything else you see on top of that paints David in a different light is apologetic. It's making him look better than he was for different reasons. It was for the good of Israel, not for the good of David's pocketbook and his administration. I don't want to say it was that selfish. It sounds really selfish to put it that way. David cared about his nation, but he cared about being king too and establishing his will over the people. So that's all about this whole establishing the cultic center of Yahweh worship. And I want to go into a little bit more about David's empire before we get to really the next section. So Delaney says, how are you? Are you knowledgeable of David's son Solomon? Yeah, and we're going to hit him just a little bit in this whole series as we go on, Delaney. I've got some knowledge of Solomon. And let's see, Kingdom of Heaven, based on true events. Did he really wear a mask? That was the king of Jerusalem at the time. That was during the Crusades. So yeah, he was a leper. I don't know if he wore a mask. Solomon had a thing for demons, says Kat. Yeah, we talked about that a little bit last night. That according to, I know, Masonic rites, and some of this is stuff I think anybody can find out, is that Solomon is said to have possessed the ring of power, the ring that gave him dominion over the demons. And the demon caste came up and helped Solomon build the temple in Jerusalem. And he had the one ring to rule them all, where we heard that before. So let's see. Kat, you got a bunch of stuff in here. Demons and demonology. Let's see. This is all about Solomon. We're not so into Solomon yet, so be here when we get into Solomon and we can talk about some of that stuff in more detail. Let's see. I'm going to go back just a little bit and see if there's anything else I need to address. Rocky's in the room. How you doing, Rocky? Didn't see you come in. Good to have you here, brother. Rocky and I, by the way, in less than an hour, will be on together with the Situation Room, 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, midnight Eastern. Just as I told you at the beginning, that's where we'll be. And by the way, folks, let me insert a little live ad, if you will. I want you to go to my Etsy site. I know, like Jeff with his stuff, he's got donations you can give and things. I don't have anything like that set up yet. But you know what you can do? You can go pick up some of the shirts and some of the merchandise I make. I did a shirt specifically for this series on the life of David. And if you go to my Etsy page, just go over to streamingtalkradio.com, click on the links. You'll find the Etsy page listed there. It's my Son of a Patriot page. I did a shirt. It's the first shirt in the listing on there. To paste the link here is just impossible. It's a long link. I can do that if I want to, but you can go pick up the shirt. It's the image that was on last night's the header for the show, showing David from overhead dragging the head of Goliath across the mosaic Star of David floor. And it's a shirt I designed specifically commemorating this, and that hopefully is cool enough, damn cool enough to wear. And we only offer it in the dark colors because it's a dark image. So black shirt and dark navy blue, I think dark brown, some of those, but it looks best on black if you get it. Go over there and pick up a shirt. Do that tonight. You can go take a look at it. You can see it on my Facebook page from posts from yesterday. You can also go over to my Etsy page and you'll see it. And let's see. Here, I got to show Rocky's post. I don't have any moderators in here, I don't think. Should make Rocky. Oh, Audrey is. I should make Rocky a moderator. He just put the link to the Rocky Stucci's now a moderator here, by the way. You can go to my Etsy page. Rocky just posted the link. Stucci is an angel, a messenger. You all are. Why, thank you, Kat. That's the one you want, says Jeannie. Go get that shirt. It helps us here. If I sold 2 or 3 of them, it's fine. It gets us a few dollars. We make a little bit of profit off of each shirt. Certainly not enough to sustain my livelihood and my 17 illegitimate children across the country. But let's say we sold 1,000 of those. That would make for a nice summer. So anyway, go over there, pick up the shirt. You're going to enjoy it. I think you'll like wearing it. I think you'll like the imagery. As Professor Bauer said, he said, Scotty, that's some serious imagery. Something like that, he said. So there you go. Rocky, you are angelic. You now have a halo and a wrench over here. So, all right, let's get back in it here. I want to just see, I'm looking at my notes here to see how much of this I've got. Not much. Oh, wait. A little bit. The next section we're going to hit, the major section, is going to be David under attack. All the desperate times that he falls under through his family, through the Philistines, through the rebellion of his own son, Absalom. We're going to see all of that stuff. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about David's empire. And from the center of his kingdom, Jerusalem, we can look outward to the peripheries. David is lauded not only for his piety in the Bible, but also for his military conquests. He's credited with expanding the borders and the influence of Israel to virtually all the surrounding nations. As a matter of fact, I mentioned this once before. Do you remember when we talked about the Exodus reality and that the city of Pithom and Ramses, Pi-Ramses, was built by Ramses II? And it says in the Bible that the children of Israel, while slaves in Egypt, built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, or Pi-Ramses. That's why they always put the Exodus under the reign of Ramses II. Well, that's wrong. These were later, 1,000 years after the event. These rabbis who went to the Library of Alexandria, they reconstructed the scriptures. They didn't remember the name of the old city. There was no record of that. They called it Pithom and Ramses. Well, the city that the Hebrews built, the Israelites, was actually beneath Pithom and Ramses, the city of Avaris. And they've done excavations at Avaris, found the city. But you know what the Egyptians make you do? They make you cover it right back up. Anybody who excavated there, you have to cover it back up. Because if an archaeologist could establish that the Israelites dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the Nile Delta region, historically, the Egyptian government today believes that that will somehow give current day Israel some kind of idea that they have rights to that land. And they don't want to open up that door if possible. So they deny people the right to really dig too deep into Avaris, although we know it exists. Now, that's changed a little bit, but that caution is still there because Egypt doesn't want to lose to Israel its land. So David expanded the kingdom of all these surrounding nations. And David's kingdom is often described as an empire. He's collecting tribute from vanquished foes all over the place. The biblical claim to this empire has remained a fundamental aspect of Jewish self-definition for thousands of years, 3,000 years. And so much so that when the State of Israel was founded in 1948 and the UN took their vote, it was understood by many that since David had conquered most of what is now Jordan and Syria, Israel was, in accepting a partition of Palestine that gave it a rather small territory, generously relinquishing its traditional rights to more than half of David's empire in the name of peace with its neighbors, even though most of the people there weren't direct descendants of the ancient Israelites. So this was this generosity that the world seemed to think that Israel was giving up half of its land. And David's conquests are an important touchstone for the history of the land of Israel. Yet virtually everything we know about these victories comes from a single chapter in the Bible, 2 Samuel 8. And now we have to evaluate this claim and the picture of David's kingdom that's presented here. The first Israelite victory recorded in 2 Samuel 8 is over the Philistines. It's not natural enough for the biblical authors to just emphasize David's battles against the Philistines by placing them at the head of the chapter. For victory over Israel's longtime nemesis was one of the basic rationales for both Saul's and David's kingships in the first place, to stave off and conquer the Philistines, their greatest nemesis. The extent of this victory by David, however, is completely ambiguous. It's usually assumed that David actually defeated the Philistines in their heartland along the coast, thereby establishing Israel's right to that fertile territory, which is that strip of Israel, the flatlands, before you get to the Mediterranean in Israel. And as a matter of fact, the capital of Israel today, as you all know, is Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem. Tel Aviv is out on the Mediterranean coast as part of Israeli property and part of the nation. And so the extent of this victory is a little generalized in the Bible. And the text, however, says that only David only attacked Philistines, not the Philistines. See that little word messing around with the language? He attacked Philistines, not the Philistines. And it seemed that this battle was not full-fledged assault on the Philistine homeland. Gezer, or Gezer, however you want to say it. The Philistine-controlled town closest to the Israelite territory was still in Philistine hands into the reign of Solomon. So David never conquered the Philistines in any substantial way. They remained firmly in control of their coastal cities for the duration of his life. The second verse of 2 Samuel 8 records David's victory over Moab, the nation across the Jordan. To the east of Judah, it's across the Jordan River. And that's present-day Jordan. And it's like you've seen if you saw the Indiana Jones movies, and we know all this. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the city of Petra, that city that's carved out of the mountain, that's back in between this narrow passageway in the cliffs. and you get to this little city. And that's in Jordan. That's where that is. And so, unlike this long established Philistine enemy in David's time, Moab had barely coalesced into a meaningful political entity at all. And it's therefore fairly unclear what it even would have meant for David to conquer the entire nation of Moab. That would be kind of like the United States military and all its power moving on Puerto Rico and conquering Puerto Rico. I think we could probably do it in a couple of hours. So it's like, David conquered the entire nation of Moab, which is pretty much Puerto Rico to the United States. And so the text never quite makes the claim explicitly, though it tries to imply it. So on the contrary, just as in the case of the Philistines in the previous verse, the Bible provides no detail whatsoever about the scope of David's victory. Not a single town or region is mentioned, which strongly suggests that not a single town or region was even taken. For the biblical authors would be sure to say so. If he took certain towns, if he had conquered Gath, and David conquered Gath. They don't say that anywhere. That's just like when we say that David went out under Saul. Saul slew his thousands and David his tens of thousands, if you remember that. When he was working for Saul, he went out and had skirmishes with the Philistines. And so maybe burning the cornfield of a Philistine town, it would come back and David conquered over the Philistines today. That's kind of what you got here. So regime change was often the occasion for such adventures in the ancient Near East. This was a border skirmish, perhaps the results of some small band of Moabites testing the strength of the new kingdom to their west. As John Ward used to tell me about Egypt, when you'd see the troubles over there, it would start with somebody shaking their fist, and then they'd throw a sandal, and then they'd start throwing rocks. Then out came the rubber bullets and the tear gas, and then the real weaponry. That's kind of when these guys were shaking their sandals at David. And so it was never obvious how powerful a new ruler would be. And so the rise of this new king often coincided with external attacks or internal revolts. And people were always up shaking the chain, seeing what they could get away with. That's a new king. Let's see what we can do. And pretty much, I think, was the case here, as David is coalescing his empire. Most important, there's no record of a country named Moab having been subjugated by David. In the monumental inscription of the Moabite king Mesha from the end of the 9th century BCE, the same century David lived, the subjugation of Moab is attributed to the Israelite king Omri, which is a descendant of David's. And so, wow, there's some heavy-duty yelling going on here. Every time I do this program, almost every night you hear a little yelling going on out there. It's 10:21 here, and my 3 little kids are not yet in bed. My wife is out there wrangling them. So tonight, I think she's having some problems with them. So if you hear yelling, it's not an EVP. It's not anything hostile. It's my wife trying to herd cats with my children. So here we have another example of the biblical authors suggesting that David controlled territory that he really didn't. And from the Philistines in the west, the Moabites in the east, 2 Samuel 2 turns to the north to describe David's defeat of the Arameans, led by Hadadezer, the king of Zobah, territory that now belongs to Syria. Here again, however, the text implies more than it proves. The battle described in 2 Samuel 8 did not take place on Aramean soil, but rather in Ammon, the Transjordan nation, north of Moab. Ammon had been Israelites' enemy during Saul's reign. In fact, some, if not all, of Saul's authority derived from his ability to successfully defend the town of Jabesh Gilead from the advances of the Ammonite king Nahash. That's in 1 Samuel 11. Saul's enemy, however, was David's friend. David refers to the fact that Nahash kept faith with him, using a technical term for treaty partnership. And after the death of Nahash and the rise of his son Hanun to the Ammonite throne, David recognized an opportunity to test the limits of his power. And again, regime change and international renegotiations went hand in hand. And the war against Ammon served also this political purpose for David within Israel. His rejection of his former treaty obligations to Ammon would have been popular with the Israelites, especially those in Gilead, the region most directly threatened by the Ammonites. And so, upon David's aggression, Ammon turned for help to its allies in Aram, and soldiers from Zobah, Makkah, and Tob, all these city-states just to the north of Israelite territory. And by the way, all these city-states, you go to Israel today, you go out in the hill country, and you can see all these ruins. It looks like, oh, what was here? There's a little town here. All these ruins, or all these old city-states are in ruins. Well, most of them are. And so you can go to these places. It's the sequence of battles against these armies, detailed in 2 Samuel 10, that's referred to in 2 Samuel 8 as the defeat of the Arameans. David did not extend Israel's border to the north into Aram. He extended them east across the Jordan into Ammon. And the Arameans, or the Arameans were defeated not even in Aramean territory. Now, there's no record of David campaigning anywhere in Aram to the north of Israel. He never occupied Aramean territory. What he did, or the text doesn't even say that he did. The text implies, perhaps, that David really had taken this territory. The biblical authors would have proclaimed it and celebrated it. Since again, you see that apologetic at play. So Ammon, on the other hand, the actual object of the battles in which David fought the Arameans, was authentically subjugated. And it's really, I think, striking to note the difference between the reports that imply conquest, where there was none, and those that describe real conquests. They come across very differently, but they're all listed the same. David captured a royal city. Joab attacked Rabbah of Ammon, the capital. All of these kinds of things. Rabbah was forced into forced labor under David. He subjugated the inhabitants with saws, iron threshing boards, and iron axes, or assigned them to brick making. It's kind of like the Israelites going, hey, we had to do it in Egypt for 400 years. Stop complaining. Shut up. So this description, it's a contrast. There's no evidence that David ever subjugated Israelites to labor. And it's a contrast to what we find in other places, where references to booty, booty, and forced labor are generic at best. And when the Bible authors have details to give, they give them freely. And they don't. And when they don't, they don't. And so the last victory mentioned in 2 Samuel 8 is over the Edomites, the nation to the southeast of Israel. Early in its existence, Edom territory was confined mostly to the southern Negev, that area down beneath Israel to the south that leads you down to Egypt and the Sinai and Egypt. And as we know from the biblical story in Numbers 21 of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, they're prevented from moving straight up into Canaan by the Edomites, whose territory they're forced to circumvent. The value of this territory was mostly for its trade routes, which brought rare goods, spices, precious metals. He who owns the spice controls the universe. Some of you know what that's a reference from. He stationed garrisons in Edom. In all of Edom, he stationed garrisons. And all the Edomites became vassals of David. and it might be trustworthy. That may have actually happened. Solomon controlled Edomite territory as he kept his fleet in the Edomite city of Ezion-Geber. That's in 1 Kings 9. But the fact that in Solomon's time this area was still referred to as Edomite suggests that it wasn't annexed to Israel, but rather controlled by Israel, controlled by them. And it seems most likely that then David's conquest of Edom consisted mostly of a seizure of the southern Negev and the establishment of garrisons to protect the trade routes. And so, remarkably, archaeological evidence supports this process. An unusually high number of settlements in the Negev appeared out of nowhere in the 10th century BCE. This is when David ruled the area, and all these little towns and garrisons popped up all over the place. So in 2 Samuel 8, then, we have the biblical argument for the creation of a Davidic empire. To the north, not so much to the north, but to the east and the west and the south. And the text is arranged geographically, with the conquest of the Philistines to the west, the Moabites to the east, the Arameans to the north, the Edomites to the south. And the artfulness of this construction is very telling, especially when we recognize that those in the north, the Arameans, were really defeated in Ammon to the east. The chapter is not a straightforward historical account, but it's a piece of propaganda. Go figure. It's intended to magnify David's conquest to give the impression of a mighty empire that stretched in all directions. It's like calling the corners. All directions David ruled. And that's the apologetic, making him look better than he was. Notably, it appears to be yet another piece of pro-David one-upmanship regarding Saul. For you have to take notice of the verse that describes Saul's military triumphs. Quote, he waged war on every side against all his enemies, against the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the king of Zobah, and the Philistines. And wherever he turned, he worsted them. That's 1 Samuel 14. Now, this is precisely the same list of nations we find in 2 Samuel 8. Even down to the kings of Zobah, David hardly could be made to seem less powerful than his unworthy predecessor, Saul, when it came to his military successes and the expansion of his kingdom. I just got the notice that be sure to watch Rocky Stucci on the Situation Room here in YouTube 30 minutes from now. So we're just about going to wrap this up for tonight, so we have a little break in between. And so you can go get a drink or something, prep yourself for Rocky and me, coming to you live at 11, midnight out east. So scholars have further argued that 2 Samuel 8, it's a chapter of a piece with royal propaganda from elsewhere in the Near East, especially monumental and wow, you've got to hear that one. So as a piece of propaganda, it's been remarkably successful, as it's written in the Bible story. Even the later biblical authors of the 2 books of Chronicles accepted the story as presented here. So Chronicles says explicitly that David captured Gath from the Philistines. It's a claim made nowhere in the book of Samuel. And so in the end then, what we can say about the extent of David's kingdom, to the west, it was no larger than it had been in Saul's time. The Philistines still controlled all of that territory. To the north, Israel maintained its previous boundaries, with the northernmost point still being the city of Dan. This is reflected in the Bible, the typical description of Israel's territory, from Dan to Beersheba. It's a phrase to describe Israel in the time of Samuel. And his census, the same thing, at the time of Solomon. The Arameans remained a formidable power to the north, becoming Israel's main rival and even overlord in the 9th century BCE. To the south, David made inroads into the Negev territory of the Edomites, though this was less a conquest than a transfer of influence over the trade routes. So this area was virtually uninhabited before David installed garrisons there to protect the trade routes. So the traditional phrase from Dan to Beersheba reflects the fact that Beersheba remained the southernmost major settlement in Israelite territory, even after the time of David. So it was only to the east, in his conquering of Ammon, Jordan, that David expanded with any real force. Yet, this was really not such a great distance. Rabbah is only about 20 miles from the Jordan Valley. And you can see on a clear day from the Jordan Valley, you can see today a little flash on the border, the speck of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. That's how close all these things were. The territories just to the east of the Jordan were probably already Israelite, or at least pro-Israelite rather than Ammonite. For these are the regions in which the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and part of Manasseh, 3 of the tribes of Israel, are said to have settled in Numbers. Consider, for example, Jabesh Gilead, the town oppressed by the Ammonites, the town that reacted or rescued Saul's body from the wall. It's on the Ammonite side of the Jordan. This diminishes even further the Ammonite territory to be conquered by David. The conquest of Ammon was a real conquest and a real subjugation, perhaps the only one of its kind in all of David's reign, but it was hardly a major expansion for the Davidic kingdom. Nor was Ammon this major power like the Philistines. So the largest view we can realistically maintain of David's kingdom is not very different from what it was at the beginnings of David's reign. It could, and you notice how the language is, you go, great, glorious expansion. Really not that much more. It's an apologetic. It could hardly be called an empire. It wasn't any stronger than Philistia or the Armenian peoples to the west and the north. And compared with Egypt and Mesopotamia, it remained a virtual non-entity, Israel. They were so brand new as far as this expansion of territory. And note that David is never said to have had any diplomatic contact with either of those 2 great superpowers, Mesopotamia and Egypt, during any time in his reign. Never any contact. Israel under David remained what it had always been, a minor state, a blip on the radar in the Middle East. And it was largely confined to the central hill country of Judah and Israel, with these expanded things that they were doing out there. And so the current idea of the modern state of Israel, small though it may be, is in fact perhaps larger. Current day Israel is probably larger than David's kingdom ever was. And certainly the coastal plain, almost all the way up to Jaffa, would not have been under David's control. On the other hand, the West Bank would have been David's heartland, the Gaza Strip. That was his heartland, even extending a little into what is now Jordan. But the Davidic empire of tradition, stretching from the border of Egypt up to the Euphrates, is a gross exaggeration. The biblical account is propagandistic at best. And that propaganda has been accepted as fact for thousands of years. To give David credit where it is due, however, simply maintaining the newly expanded borders of his kingdom was achievement enough for this guy. And he left a territory secure enough that it could endure, at least for the most part, for many generations. For a small kingdom with a few natural resources at its disposal, a widely scattered populace, no tradition of statehood, this was pretty damned impressive for David. But it's not the Davidic empire of tradition. That empire probably never even existed. And you know what? It's 10:35. So we're going to leave off right there. Tomorrow's Thursday. So I have Consequential Rapscallions, I do declare, with Jeffrey Doughty at same bat time at 9 p.m. And then I'll be back Friday, pending any disaster. I'll be back Friday, and we'll take up with this, David under attack, his kingdom under attack. So there you go. There we are for tonight, folks. I'm just going to go back through and see if there's anything that anybody had to say in here that I need to make mention of. Let's see. let's see. He's turned 4-year-old. Can't go to sleep till after 2 a.m. That says Michelle. Every night. Oh, that's my son, Flynn. Flynn is a night owl. That boy, I got to tell you what, I'll get up in the middle of the night because I hear something. I get up at about 2:30 in the morning, and Flynn's watching TV. And I go, what are you doing? And he said, oh, can I watch another movie? This one's almost over. I'm like, no, go to bed. But then he doesn't like to get up till 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I don't like that. I'd rather have my children wake up bright and early and enjoy the day early. Whenever I stay up late to have to work on a project or something, not that midnight, 1 o'clock isn't late enough after Situation Room. If I'm up late till about 3 in the morning working on something, I'll sleep a little late, but my body always wakes me up after 4 or 5 hours. I think my son's going to be the same way. So let's see. I'm seeing talk about bicycles, bikes with motors, Petra. Yeah, I'd like to go see Petra. It's a pretty cool place. I have not been there. Let's see. What are we talking about? The Y shape of the Y chromosomes. Okay, that's totally different. Like a magic lamp. I'm missing some of what this is about. That's what Sue said in response to. I'm going backwards. So amazing what you can manifest with a rub of a nipple. Hey, Rocky. Yeah. Rocky Stucci and his nipples. So let's see. I'm going back. Just conversation. That's good. I'm glad you're all talking about this stuff. Please go to my Etsy shop. Rocky put a link in, but here, if I copy it one more time, I'll paste it in. You can help support what I do by going and buying some of my merchandise. Please. T-shirts is all I've got for the David thing so far. But if you go take a look, I think you're going to like the shirt. It's cool. Go pick it up. You'll enjoy it. If you want me to, probably in the next day, I'll probably add maybe some V-necks for the ladies, because I've had a lot of women ask me if we did V-necks. I might add hoodies in there, maybe even a coffee mug. I don't know. So you can also get them for the Reptilians book. You can get them for the Senenmut stuff we did. So there you go. All right. That's it, folks. That's all we got. I'll see you tomorrow night with Jeff Dougherty at this same time, 9 o'clock, for the Consequential Rapscallions. And I'll see you in about 20 minutes, exactly 20 minutes, over on Rocky's channel for the Situation Room. So I'm going to go make some more coffee, splash a little water on my face, and I'll see you over there. I love you all. Thanks for being here. It means a lot to me that you'd give me your time and be here. See you later.